Imagine it is late November in the year 747, somewhere in the heartland of what we might loosely call Francia, though that name still means something fragile and contested here. More a direction than a destiny. The harvest is in, what there is of it. The last of the autumn slaughter has been done. The salted pork packed into its barrels, the smoked haunches hung from the rafters of the great hall. Outside, the ground is beginning to harden with the first serious cold, and the short days are getting shorter still. There is nothing to farm, nowhere particular to go, and for the first time in months, the body is allowed something other than exhaustion. Tonight, there will be food. There will be ale. There will be fire and noise and the voice of a man who knows how to hold a room. Tonight, there will be something that might, across all the distance of 13 centuries, still feel recognizable to you. Tonight, there will be entertainment. We tend to think of the Dark Ages as relentlessly grim, a world of famine and plague and crumbling masonry, a civilization holding its breath between catastrophes. And in many ways, that picture is accurate. The population of Western Europe had fallen sharply from its Roman peak. Trade networks had contracted. Literacy had retreated almost entirely into the monastery. Cities that had once held tens of thousands now sheltered a few hundred people in the shadow of ruins they could not maintain and did not fully understand. Life expectancy was short, infant mortality crushing, and the margin between survival and disaster was razor thin for most people alive in 747. All of that is true, and we should not pretend otherwise. But it is also true that these were human beings, and human beings do not simply endure. They celebrate, they gather, they make music and tell stories and drink together and laugh. And the evidence for all of this, tucked away in chronicles and law codes and the occasional illuminated manuscript, is richer than most people expect. To understand entertainment in the early medieval world, you have to understand the hall, not the great stone castles that would come centuries later, but the timber hall, long and rectangular, built from post and beam and wattle, its roof thatched, its floor earthen or scattered with rushes. Excavations at sites like Yevering in Northumbria, which dates to the late 6th and early 7th century, have given archaeologists a remarkable picture of these structures. The Great Hall at Yevering was roughly 25 meters long, built on massive timber posts, with a central hearth that would have dominated the interior with firelight and smoke in roughly equal measure. The roof had no chimney, only a smoke hole or gap at the ridge, which meant that any gathering inside involved a perpetual low haze at eye level and the permanent smell of burning wood embedded in every piece of clothing and every strand of hair. This is important to hold in your imagination when you picture the entertainment that happened here, because it was not entertainment consumed in comfort. It was entertainment experienced in smoke and heat and proximity, bodies pressed together on benches, the firelight making everything flicker. The feast itself was the central event. In Frankish aristocratic culture in 747, the feast was simultaneously a meal, a political ritual, a religious observance, and a performance. The Carolingian court under Carloman and Pippin the Short, who were at this very moment dividing their inheritance and jostling for power, placed enormous emphasis on the communal meal as an expression of hierarchy and loyalty. To sit at a lord's table, to be given food from his stores, to drink his ale, was to acknowledge his authority and accept his protection. Seating arrangements mattered intensely. The high table was not a metaphor. It was often literally elevated, placed on a low dais at one end of the hall so that the Lord and his closest companions could be seen by everyone and could see them in return. The food served at the high table was different in quality. not just quantity, from what reached the lower benches, and everyone in the room understood the message this sent. What were they actually eating and drinking in a prosperous Frankish hall in 747? Pork was the prestige meat of the early medieval world. The forests of Francia were managed as much for pig forage, a practice called pannage, as for timber, and archaeological bone assemblages from elite sites consistently show high percentages of pig remains, particularly younger animals slaughtered for their tenderness. There would have been bread, almost certainly a mixed grain loaf, rye and barley with perhaps some wheat for the wealthy, dense and dark and filling. Root vegetables, legumes, whatever the harvest had produced. And then the ale. Ale was not a luxury in the early medieval world. It was a nutritional necessity, a caloric supplement in a diet that was often borderline adequate, and a safer drink than water from sources frequently contaminated by settlement runoff. Frankish ale in this period was typically unhopped, brewed from barley or wheat, flavored sometimes with a mixture of herbs known as gruet, which might include yarrow, bog myrtle, or wild rosemary depending on the region. The alcohol content was low by modern standards, probably between 2 and 4%, which meant that steady consumption over the course of a long evening produced a warm, sociable haze rather than incapacitation. The ale kept flowing because the ale was, in a real sense, part of the meal. And into this smoke and firelight and the smell of salt pork and warm bread, the performer arrived. The scop, as the Anglo-Saxons called him, or the Germanic equivalent in the Frankish world, was a professional. This is worth emphasizing, because we sometimes romanticize the wandering bard as a kind of spontaneous folk artist. But the evidence from Beowulf, from the court literature that survives in fragments from this period, from the later sagas that preserve earlier oral traditions, is clear that the skilled performer was a trained specialist who commanded real payment and real respect. The poet who could hold a hall, who could recite genealogies from memory, who knew which heroes to praise and how to tie the Lord's ancestors to the great deeds of the mythological past, was doing something genuinely difficult and genuinely valuable. In a world without literacy for most people, without writing as a practical tool for ordinary life, oral performance was the primary technology for transmitting cultural memory. The scop was not just entertainment. He was a living archive. Boss, what did they perform? The answer is more varied than the gloomy stereotype suggests. There were certainly heroic narratives, the long alliterative poems that celebrated battles, loyal companions, monstrous adversaries overcome by courage and cunning. These were the prestige forms, the ones that made it into manuscript eventually, the ones we can still partially read. But the monastic sources also complain, with remarkable frequency and evident frustration, about the other kinds of performance that filled these halls, the buffoons and jesters and acrobats and animal trainers and dice games and gambling, and the songs the monks describe as lascivious and inappropriate and entirely too popular. The council held at Cloveshow in England in 747, that very year. It included provisions warning clergy against keeping poets and musicians and entertainers in their households, which tells us both that this was happening extensively and that the church found it deeply concerning. When the reformers feel the need to prohibit something in writing, you can be fairly confident it was widespread. Music was everywhere in the early medieval world, and here the archaeology becomes genuinely exciting. Lyres have been found in Germanic graves across northern Europe, including the famous reconstruction from Sutton Hoo, where the impression of a 6-stringed lyre survived in the grave goods of a 7th century East Anglian king. These were not large instruments. They were intimate, designed to be held in the lap and plucked or strummed, their sound carrying in an enclosed hall, but not across any great distance outdoors. Bone flutes, simple percussion instruments, and the Carnix-derived horn traditions of Northern Europe all appear in the archaeological record. The specific repertoire is largely lost to us because music in 747 was not written down. The notation systems that would eventually produce Gregorian chant were still being developed, and secular music left almost no written trace. What we have instead is the echo of the music in the poetry it accompanied, the rhythmic structures of Old English and Old High German verse that were designed to be sung or chanted rather than simply spoken. The games and physical entertainments are worth dwelling on because they complicate the narrative of a purely somber age, where wrestling and tests of strength were standard features of the feast and the assembly. The Thing, the Germanic outdoor assembly, which was simultaneously a legal court and a communal gathering, included athletic competition as a matter of course. Board games were genuinely popular. The Hnefatafl family of strategy games, which had spread across the Germanic and Norse worlds from Scandinavia, appears in archaeological contexts from Ireland to Russia, a game that required planning, pattern recognition, and the ability to sustain attention over a long sequence of moves. Dice appear in countless excavation contexts, usually carved from bone or antler. And the documentary sources make clear that gambling with dice was a persistent feature of tavern culture and hall culture alike, a one the church tried intermittently and unsuccessfully to suppress. The tavern itself deserves a moment, because it is not a concept we usually associate with the Dark Ages. But the alehouse, the wayside inn catering to travelers and traders and local people with nowhere better to spend an evening, existed continuously from the Roman period through the early medieval world. In the remnants of Roman towns that were still inhabited, often in reduced form, the physical infrastructure of Roman commercial entertainment sometimes lingered. English documentary sources from the 7th and 8th centuries mention taverns explicitly, and the monastic complaints about clergy frequenting them have the tired quality of people repeating a rule that everyone already knows will not be followed. These were not sophisticated establishments. A dark room to a bench, someone willing to sell you a cup of ale from whatever they had brewed that week. But they were gathering places, and in a world of scattered farms and poor roads, a gathering place was not nothing. The church's ambivalence about all of this is itself a fascinating window into early medieval culture. The same monastic tradition that preserved Beowulf and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle also produced an almost continuous stream of prohibitions against precisely the kind of entertainment those texts describe. Bishops complained about dancing at church festivals. Councils regulated what music was appropriate for holy days, which implies that a great deal of music on holy days was considered inappropriate. The tension between official Christian culture and the older, deeply rooted traditions of seasonal celebration, and of the midwinter feast and the midsummer fire and the harvest gathering that had its own ancient rhythms, was not a tension that the church resolved in 747. It was a negotiation that would continue for centuries, and in many ways, the folk traditions that survived into early modern Europe, the village feast, the community ale, the harvest celebration with its songs and games, are the partially Christianized descendants of exactly the entertainments being negotiated in the halls and taverns of the 8th century. There is something worth sitting with here, something that resists the standard narrative of the Dark Ages as pure loss and contraction. The Roman world that had preceded this one had its own spectacular entertainments: the amphitheater, the chariot race, the professional theater, all of which vanished with the infrastructure and the urban populations that had sustained them. What replaced them was smaller, more intimate, more embedded in community. The hall feast, the local scop, the shared ale, and the board game by firelight, these were not the Colosseum, but they were not nothing either. They were the entertainment of a world that had pulled back inside itself, that had contracted to the scale of the village and the valley and the winter hall, and had made something human and sustaining within those limits. Visit the reconstructed halls at sites like West Stowe in Suffolk or Ledgera in Denmark today, and you can stand in spaces that archaeologists have built to match the timber structures of this period, and you can feel, at least partially, what the scale of these gatherings was. Low ceilings, firelight, the smell of wood smoke, not large enough to hide in. Every person visible to every other person. Entertainment in this world was not something you consumed passively in the dark. It was something you participated in, as audience, as singer, as the person who filled the cup again, as the one who knew the next verse of the old song. That participation, that insistence on gathering and making noise, and celebrating the fact of having survived another harvest, is one of the most recognizable and quietly remarkable things the people of 747 left behind. We just have to know where to look.